Hello you dirty potters! How are you today? In today's video we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on being a little more proficient at centering. These are some of the tips and tricks that I've learned and some tips and tricks that I teach my students who know how to center but want to center at a higher level. In my experience, if you're newer on the wheel, you learn how to center, but you still have some trouble with a little bit of the squeeze amount here and there. This, if that makes sense. The stuff that would make centering faster, more pleasurable, and make it far more efficient for you on a higher level, bumping you up from the beginner to the intermediate version of centering, as it were. Now, if you're looking for a video on how to center, this is not that video. I've already made that video quite some time ago, and I will link it down below and somewhere on screen for you right now. That way you can watch that video before you get onto this stage. With that being said, let's get started. The first tip I have to give you begins before we even start the wheel, and that is making it stick. This seems to be a bit of a problem for some people because they don't understand how this thing sticks in the first place, nor do they understand the amount of time they need to let pass before making it stick. I see lots of people who make the mistake of just lightly putting their clay down like this, spinning the wheel with a little bit of water and starting, only for it to come off very easily once they've started to center. There's two things that I see almost all professional wheel throwers do to make this really stick so that you can really give it your all when you're centering. Number one, we really hit this hard. We hit this down really hard on the center. Like this. And we try and get it as centered as possible. Number two, they don't throw it down like this and just start throwing from this point. The high majority of potters that I see pound this out into kind of a cone shape right here on the skirt. And keep in mind, we're not lightly tapping it. We're really going through the clay itself and putting it into this cone formation. Some of you might be worried that it's not completely centered. At this point, it doesn't really matter that it's centered because the act of centering ought to center it, not the pre-stages before that. Potter tip! A little potter tip here, some people are working with larger amounts of clay. This is probably like 1.5 pounds, but some people are working with 5 pounds and above. If you're having trouble with your clay sticking at this point, do the 2 steps that I suggested, and then run your finger along what we call the skirt of the pot, like this. This will give it a little bit of extra stick-to-itiveness. These are the 3 steps that I personally do before I even put water onto the clay to try and center it. I also give it a little bit of time so that it can start sticking. The only real reason this is sticking right now, and it's hard to get it off because I stuck it so well, the only real reason this is sticking so well right now is because there's technically moisture in the clay body, but there's no moisture here. And it kind of evens out, it sticks to itself, for lack of a better term. You can even see the giant wet spot that the clay left. So before you actually start centering, make sure you slam it real good down on the wheel. You pat it up real nice, making that cone shape, which will make it easier for you to center in the future, and you make sure you fuse it real well to the wheel. These 3 steps will help ensure that your clay sticks to the wheel itself. A big potter tip here, and I'm only saying this because I have so many students do this, there seems to be a misconception with the way things stick on the wheel. The only reason that this is sticking to the wheel is because this is dry, and this is technically wet. When you slam this down, you should see a large water spot right here in the place that it was. I see a couple of students do some of this business right here, where they wet the actual wheelhead itself and then try and stick this to the wheelhead. This will make it actively not stick. And if you now slam your clay onto this puddle of water right here, it'll pretty much shotgun little pellets of water everywhere to yourself and your neighbors. On top of that, this does not make this stick. If I slam this down here and I pat this down like this, my stuff's gonna move everywhere. This is not stable. The entire thing with putting water on clay is so that it hydroplanes by your hands so you can put more pressure on it. By putting this down beforehand, this does not make it stick whatsoever. This makes it slide everywhere. So make sure your wheel head is nice and dry before you stick your pottery to the wheel. The second thing we're going to talk about should be remembered throughout the entire process. As you start to put water on your pot and center, you should be centering from the bottom of your piece. I see many people who start to just center from this point right here, where technically I'm not touching the very bottom of my piece, or what I like to call the skirt of the piece. So even people who proficiently cone up and down in order to center on the wheel and do this, they're often not touching this very bottom of the piece. This does 2 things. Firstly, when you start to pull, this will be a large, uneven amount of clay at the very skirt of your centered piece. Secondly, you're leaving a lot of excess and unneeded clay at the very bottom. To fix this, the grip of your fingers when you center need to be rubbing on the bottom of the wheel, so that when you scrunch them in, the skirt of the piece comes up with you. And all I really did is, as I centered and took that clay up with me, I started with my fingers at the bottom of the skirt instead of leaving it down there and centering a bit higher. So when centering, you should almost always start at the base where the skirt meets the wheel, bringing that clay up as you cone up and down. The next tip is a big one. It has a lot to do with coning up and down, which is essentially a continuation on wedging, except for you're doing it on the wheel instead of on the ground or a wedging table. If you don't know how to cone up and down, I will put that video down in the description below, just like I did the centering video, or I will post it somewhere here on screen for you, so it's an easy click away. Now, as we talked about in the previous tip, we're going to start from the bottom where the wheel meets the skirt of the piece when we're centering. When you are coning up and down, you ought to be bringing all of the clay up by pushing pressure and bringing your hands at the edges of the elbows, really, all the way up like this, right? And notice something here. I'm not technically moving my hands. My hands, especially being at the wrists, are not the ones technically moving. Realistically, when I'm coning up and down, or at least centering, I'm just moving my elbows and my hands are applying pressure. So what's really going on is that I'm squeezing the clay and then I'm moving my elbows at the hinges right here up like this and putting them back down. I'm not doing any of this. This motion is not going on here. Watch carefully as I cone up and down. You'll notice that my hands themselves don't have a lot of motion going on so that it doesn't affect the clay body. My hands are actually fairly stable, but you do see pressure being put on the clay body itself, and you do see my forearms moving up and down with the clay as I consistently put pressure. This was a very large tip for me when I first started centering. The teacher's assistant asked me, "Why are you moving your hands?" And I said, "Well, I have to move my hands in order to put pressure, right?" So I was doing a lot of this. And he was like, "Stop, that doesn't do anything. You really just need to apply pressure, and your hand kind of acts as a mold for the clay. What you're really moving is your forearms and elbows at the hinge. So you're realistically doing something like this, not like this." Keep in mind that for this to work, you do still have to put a consistent amount of pressure on the clay body itself, which means you ought to be bent over, putting pressure on whatever you're doing. If you do it correctly, you should have the clay body mold to your hand. It can even be done with one hand, so you can get a nice profile shot from here. So realistically, I'm just going to move my hand this way and my elbow a little bit down as I go. We've just centered with one hand. Keep in mind that my fingers are making contact with the entirety of the ball of clay, and this rule only doesn't apply when you're working with a very large amount of clay, like 5 or 6 pounds or something above that. But my fingers are touching all the way at the bottom of the skirt, as previously mentioned. My palms are making contact with this piece right here, so that you can really see the indentation of where my palms are touching the actual clay body, and my thumb is compressed a small amount over the top in a straight manner, this closed right here. This evens out the very top of my centered piece. My hand is acting just like a mold for the clay to run into, so it shapes itself. And as long as I am strong and keeping a constant amount of pressure, not changing it whatsoever, this will be a very well centered piece. As a final tip for a lot of you who have reached the coning up and down process, coning up and down is extremely important, but it is a stepping stone to realizing when your clay isn't completely homogenized and even through the inside out. There's about 4 or 5 different good reasons I can give you for coning up and down and wedging your clay before you get on the wheel. But the real main reason that you ought to cone up and down and wedge before you get on the wheel is so that you can have a better experience on the wheel. Clay is made out of little platelets, and these platelets slide past each other as you apply shear pressure. This kind of works on the wheel as well. But as you continue to do this, you make the clay much more homogenized and even as you throw. This gives you a much better experience so you don't end up with a wonky top as you start pulling your stuff. There's one big tip that really helped me when I first started coning up and down, and I'm about to give it to you right now. I see lots of people do this, especially new wheel throwers and centers, where they take their clay, they cone up, they get a little bit of water, and they just smash this down in order to center. This is a big no-no for me, for one very obvious reason. I'm sure you already see it. This creates a mushroom type effect. And even if from this point you start to center correctly, you might trap air underneath this flap right here from the mushroom that you just made with your Hulk smash of a center effect. On top of that, you can now see that a good portion of my clay, instead of being homogenized and squished together so that they can be nice and even for me to throw, you can see I just spread them out. So this is still kind of wobbly. This is not the effect I wanted. I just put in a lot of effort for nothing, realistically. What you really ought to do when coning up and down, or centering for that fact, is bring your clay up, and the high majority of the time, you will notice something that looks like this. This is a pretty good physical sign that your clay is not even from the inside out. Whenever I see something like this tells me that I need to do one of two things. I either need to wedge better, or I need to cone up and down more, which is kind of like a continuation of wedging, but on the wheel. This is very easily fixed if you cone up and down in the proper way. Watch me cone up and down for a bit, and this will go away very easily. You see, now that same divot that represented uneven clay on the inside of the body is no longer there. That's because coning up and down really smushed all the clay together, getting rid of those uneven marks on the inside or the internals of my clay itself. This is honestly one of the main benefits of coning up and down. It really helps even out your clay. As a final tip to anyone who is coning up and down while centering, I see lots of students do what we talked about earlier, where they'll essentially smash down their clay and do that mushroom that at times traps air in between the clay body. There seems to be a misconception in the direction that you're pushing. You're not really pushing down, you're kind of pushing over and down, like a joystick going this way. When you're coning up and down, I don't want you to push forward, I don't want you to push down. I want you to give a nice moon arc, like this. And it's very easy to see if I do it with one hand. This lets the clay go into itself without making that extra air pocket and making that mushroom that you're going to have to recenter at a later time anyway. I'm going to do it one more time just so we can really comprehend what's going on here. I brought this up into a cone-like shape. My clay is pretty homogenized. I don't see any wrinkles, so I'm pretty happy with it. I'm going to put a bit of water on the top. My palm is going to push this way and down simultaneously with my entire hand. And my thumb is resting over the very apex of my clay right here, enclosed like this. I'm not having it open. I'm closing this. I'm going to push over, and then I'm going to push down. Most of the time you will see me do this at the same time, but for now I think it's good to break it up into parts. And as you release slowly, you have a completely centered piece of work. As a final tip for those of you who are having trouble as they are coning up and down, I'm going to give you a very obvious fix to your clay ripping in half. Some people have a very hard time discerning the amount of pressure they need when they cone up and down. This results in two things as they start. Number one, they will often put too much pressure on one spot at a time. The wheel is spinning like this fairly fast, but you do have to remember you are technically putting pressure on a specific part of the clay body, which means, technically speaking, on a very small scale, you are making the clay go slower than the wheel itself. If you apply too much pressure for too long of a time on any specific part, you will essentially end up ripping this piece of clay off. This is an indicator that one of two or both things are happening. Number one, you're putting too much pressure on one specific part of the pot for too long of a time. This can be very easily fixed by either reducing the amount of pressure that you have or grip on the actual centered piece that's going up itself, or you can move your hands faster, which I often find is the fix. Many of my students will cone up and down and they'll spend a good minute right here trying to come up and find the right amount of pressure, and it will tear off just like what happened to us earlier. Oftentimes, just making sure that your hands are moving up at a steady pace and then down at a steady pace fixes this issue. Try not to spend too much time coning up and or down in one spot. And I don't mean the whole process, I truly do mean one spot. Don't do some of this. Because I've spent too much time up here and too much pressure, now I've torn off a good amount of my clay. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I really hope that helped fix a lot of the problems that people are having when they're centering, because I'm encountering a lot of people who know how to center, but they don't know how to center well. And some of these tips, if you can just master one of these per week or even per month, will really up your centering game. Especially if you get your muscle memory going, it'll take you probably 30 seconds, if that, to center a good piece of solidly wedged or taken care of clay. I'll be honest, many of us don't even wedge, but we just cone up and down on the wheel, which is technically still wedging. We just do it on the wheel when we cone up and down, which takes a lot of effort off of our backs and our knees and our elbows and our hands when we're doing it on the wedging table or the floor. If any of these tips helped you out and you were really wondering what to do about a specific problem, make sure you comment down below and let me know if any of these worked for you. They've been working for me for 12 plus years, and I hope that they really up your game when centering. Have a great day, good luck on your next art project, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week.
Thank you for your patronage.